right. So I can just say a few words, set the tone for the panel. My work has been primarily focused on nutrition epidemiology, but in the past 10, 15 years, we have been doing a lot of nutrition omics analysis, especially nutritional genomics, nutritional metabolomics, and nutritional microbiome or metagenomics analysis. I think in the past 10, 15 years, we have witnessed a major paradigm shift in epidemiology from the traditional black box epidemiology approach to the so-called systems epidemiology approach. So the system epidemiology approach integrates the tools from systems biology with traditional epidemiological studies or nutritional intervention trials. So some of the tools that we have been using include genome-wide association studies or whole genome analysis, proteomics analysis, metabolomics analysis, and now microbiome analysis. The advances in those omics technologies are just incredible. Remember, 15 years ago, when we submitted an NIH grant, we had to budget $2 per genotype. And today, $2, you can do a lot of genetic analysis, and the cost for whole genome sequencing 20 years ago was $100 million per person, and then today it's around $500 to $800, and the cost of whole genome sequencing will continue to decrease. So those technologies have provided enormous power for large cohort studies and also for nutritional intervention studies. And this type of studies have the potential to illuminate biological mechanisms, identify novel biomarkers, improve disease predictions, and identify high-risk populations for intervention, and also identify new intervention targets. So the systems epidemiology approach requires integration of population, laboratory, analytic, and translational approaches. Typically, our populations are derived from cohort studies such as birth cohorts, observational cohorts, dietary intervention studies, and nowadays, of course, electronic health records can also provide a lot of data from the populations. The laboratory approach has expanded from traditional biomarker analysis to multi-omics analysis and even functional studies. And the big data analytic approach has improved dramatically in the past 10 to 20 years. In the past, we have been primarily focused on traditional risk factor analysis, and now our analysis have expanded to high-dimensional data analytic approach, network analysis, and pathway analysis, and so on and so forth. And eventually, of course, our findings need to be translated into clinical predictions, guidelines, and policies. So I think this approach, this systems approach, is really important nowadays when we talk about lifestyle medicine, because we are not just integrating different domains of lifestyle interventions, but also we're integrating different dimensions of our research populations, laboratory approaches, big data analytic approaches, and translational research. At Harvard School of Public Health and Brigham Women's Hospital, we have been running several large cohorts for several decades now. We have 3 generations of nurses' health studies starting from 1976. And the GUTS cohort includes participants who are the offspring of nurses' 2 participants and a health professional follow-up study, a parallel cohort of male health professionals. In the past 3 to 4 decades, we have collected a massive amount of data on diet, lifestyle, health outcomes, and now we are also collecting GIS data, digital phenotyping data using variable devices. of course, it's extremely important to collect a biospecimen from those participants. Currently, we have a large number of blood samples, tumor tissue samples, urine samples, toenail samples, and we are in the process of collecting 20,000 stool samples from the participants. We also have a large number of imaging data. So I think when we talk about big data, it's also very important to talk about the quality of the data. So it's not just the big data, but also good data, because if you have too much noises in the data, the signals can be easily overwhelmed by the noises. So to improve the quality of the data, especially nutritional data, what we have been doing is not just to validate our dietary questionnaires using gold standard, but also to collect repeated data on diet and lifestyle factors. So every 4 years, we have been collecting dietary data, nutritional data, and lifestyle data, and also other factors. The repeated measures are extremely useful because we know that one measurement, especially one dietary measurement, has a lot of noises. It's like a single measure of blood pressure. It's just a snapshot, and it's not very reliable. So by using the repeated measures, we can substantially reduce the noises in our dietary data, and also represent the long-term dietary habits, because we know that people change their diet over time. And it's also very important to have high rate of follow-up, because when you follow a large number of participants for decades, it's very easy for you to lose a substantial proportion of the participants. So we have been very fortunate to achieve 90% follow-up rate even after more than 4 decades of follow-up. And the systems approach has become even more important if we want to integrate human health and planetary health, because we know that our diet has a huge influence on our environment and vice versa. So we are now trying to incorporate diet, lifestyle data at the individual levels with data at community level and the neighborhood level, and also try to incorporate data on environmental impact of our food consumption. We are now developing environmental sustainability indexes for different dietary patterns, for different foods, and trying to use the environmental sustainability index of our participants' eating habits, predict the biomarkers that we have already measured at molecular level, and also predict future risk of diseases. So I think this is an area I think has enormous potential that can give us a holistic and a comprehensive view about our diet on health outcomes, not just at the individual level, but also at the population level, and also at the environmental level. Just a quick example of how this approach has already been applied to some of the nutritional factors. Many studies have shown that regular consumption of coffee is associated with lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Almost too good to be true, right? But the data have been incredibly consistent, and it's not possible to do a large RCT to test whether consumption of coffee can actually reduce diabetes incidence. What we have been doing is to use various omics technologies to better understand the biological mechanisms through which coffee and different components of coffee risk of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. For example, we have done GWAS studies among hundreds of thousands of participants, identified more than 10 genetic variants that can predict higher or low intake of coffee, and why some people have very sensitive to caffeine, other people are less sensitive to caffeine, and to a large degree depend on the caffeine metabolism genotypes. And we have been doing gene expression analysis to identify some components of the coffee that have anti-inflammatory effects. And the proteomics analysis have also found that regular consumption of coffee can reduce pro-inflammatory cytokines in the circulation. And recently we have been running large-scale metabolomic studies to identify metabolites that can be used to predict future risk of type 2 diabetes. So I think this kind of approach, multi-omics approach, is really a major advance in nutrition epidemiology. It opened a new door for us to better understand the disease mechanisms and also identify individuals who can benefit from increasing or decreasing consumption of coffee by looking at their genetic variants, their microbiome, and their metabolic profile. So finally, I think, of course, we need to translate those kind of findings into clinical practice. And this is a very interesting study published a few years ago. Some of you may have seen this. This was done in the Israeli population, about 800 patients. The researchers collected a massive amount of data from those participants, including microbiome, blood tests, questionnaire data, anthropometrics, and food dairy, and so on and so forth. Millions of variables were entered into this machine learning algorithm. And then they developed the predictor that's called the personalized nutrition predictor, basically AI, that can tell each individual patient what kind of food to eat, what kind of food to avoid, to better control their blood sugar. What's really interesting is that in the intervention study, they found that this AI is more effective than a real dietitian in terms of improving the glycemic control among pre-diabetic patients. So it's very exciting, and the question is this feasible in clinical practice? And of course, we're still in the early stage, and this is still being replicated in other populations, but I think it has provided some promising data in terms of translating research findings into personalized nutrition.
So we're going to do this panel a little bit differently. That's why I asked Frank to come and present this at the podium. Next, I'm going to have Paul give his perspectives, and then Steve, and then I'm going to open it up to the panel to just kind of have a discussion, rather than because we have a large panel, and I want to make sure that it becomes more of a discussion. So we will then have just a generalized discussion or questions from the audience as people see fit. So Paul, please.
Okay. So we have listened to a lot of wisdom and knowledge in the room about lifestyle medicine, but I think we do face a fundamental challenge of how to channel this to our end users, and in the end also how to have traction with all these insights and ideas, because I think all in all we're just at the beginnings of it. So the background of what I'm going to tell you is the work we've been developing over the last 15 years in neurorehabilitation, in particular stroke. So on the left-hand side you see the scheme of the system we have developed. It's called the rehabilitation gaming system. The whole idea is that we deliver diagnostics and intervention via computer-based intervention scenarios, which are presented to the user as a virtual reality task space in which they perform operations in an embodied fashion. Why we do it like that is that we started with basic theoretical neuroscience. Our basic value was, don't listen to the clinicians. Why is that? Well, if you look at the impact of stroke rehabilitation since the mid-70s till now, it's basically the same on the Fugl-Meyer scale, standard scale for functional properties of stroke patients. So what we're lacking in this domain is just a theory to understand how the recovering brain actually operates. We looked at this from the perspective of theory, where we said, well, brains are embodied, brains have goals, brains exist in a sensory motor space that is continuous, that has certain statistical properties and so on. All concepts that you will not find back in your standard rehab ward. So this we packaged in a system, delivered to our patients, and on the right-hand side you see the result of a meta-analysis of our own studies that we published this year, where we show significant impact on standard scales of functional recovery, like the Fugl-Meyer, which is more looking at the muscle synergies, or CAHI, which is more functional recovery, like can you brush your teeth again, right? So the overall scheme shows that we are supporting the full patient journey, because in the end it's about supporting that patient to recover and to stay healthy over an extended period of time. So just with an acute short-term intervention, you're not going to achieve that. So we have to find a way to provide continuous support for a patient that can last for years. And this is exactly where technology comes in. Right? There's no way you can do that with humans. You cannot have your occupational therapist knock at your door every day for a therapy session. Right? So if we want to have scalable health interventions, we must rely on technologies. But to build these technologies, we need science, because otherwise you don't know what to put in your algorithms, or how to change your algorithm in case something doesn't work. Right? So for just rational decision making in this clinical context, we need theory. Without theory, we're lost, because there's a lot of data in the universe, and there are even more correlations in the universe. And correlations as such will not get us into the future. We need ideas, we need concepts, and that means we need theories. Okay, that you also know when you're wrong. So that's a starting point. But now take stroke. I started with a stroke, but I thought, look, it's the simplest thing that can go wrong with the brain, because there's a localized lesion. Okay, so if we cannot fix that one, forget these diffuse lesions after traumatic brain injury or multiple sclerosis and so on. Right? So we thought, okay, let's start simple. But if you look at the symptomatology of stroke, already you see it's a complex picture, because you have a range of domains in which you can find symptoms, and they might emerge or disappear in a very complex temporal dynamic from the acute phase on day 1 till 1 year later. For instance, depression is often a late onset symptom in stroke patients. So how now can I choose my treatment of an individual patient if I know there's a huge variety of possible symptoms? Now that's again where theory comes in. So here you see a simulation of the human connectome with 1,000 nodes, but what we visualize is the difference in the dynamics between a healthy brain and the brain of a specific patient. So now in this modeling study, where I model the brain parcellated in 1,000 nodes, following a connectivity pattern that is based on our best understanding of the statistical structure of brain signals. Now with that I can start to look at, okay, but what is now the global change in brain dynamics after this lesion? Or we can look at what's called the diastasis of the stroke. This is important, because now I can start to look in a much more rational way in how brain networks will reshape themselves or remodel themselves over time, given their plasticity due to this change in activity patterns. So now I can at least start to get an idea whether these changes will be happening more, let's say, in frontal areas, in areas more related to, let's say, affective state, or more, let's say, language networks. I can at least start to see where are the biggest risks in this brain network. And on the basis of that, I can make my informed choices on intervention planning. So that basically means, so this is now the next step in the development of these models, that we're moving towards the point that to make progress just in the domain of stroke rehabilitation, right? We have to look at inflammation, we have to look at gene expression, you have to look at changes in brain networks, you have to look at changes in behavior. This brain that now has this deficit is actually embedded in a complex network that is giving rise to this brain from a genetic perspective, but is also stimulating that brain in terms of the environment, right? So the brain that we try to heal is actually one network in a large subset of networks that we must consider all together. So this automatically brings us to this domain of network medicine. Just a reductionist perspective is not enough. So what we see is now at the horizon, and we're building this pipeline as we speak, that at the individual patient level, we have to integrate the multi-scale data, going from their genome to their behavioral and environmental conditions. With that, we can now start to build patient-specific models. You saw an earlier example earlier, on which I can start to test my interventions. The results of these interventions can now be evaluated by the clinician to be said, well, is this the kind of change I would find acceptable given the effort we have to put into it? Or is this really the right kind of protocol to use, or the right kind of intensity to use, and so on? So I can now in silico start to test my interventions before I actually start to hassle the patient with it. Once it passes that threshold, it gets delivered to the patient automatically, and then the patient can perform at home the rehabilitation that is prescribed. But that means if you look at this technological platform that supports the patient journey, in which you have actually this hidden component of large-scale network-based brain modeling, at many steps along the way, there's a lot of technological challenges you just have to solve. It's not just like, oh, we call Google and they just send us a complex algorithm, we chew all the data, and then Jesus will be reborn. It just doesn't work like this. So we have to now think about building a technology pipeline that really supports all its users, the clinicians, the patients, that allows you to collect the data that you need, that is efficient, cheap, portable, right? So there are many technology challenges along the way. And therefore, to advance and deploy and build these systems, you need a large team effort, because you need the clinical knowledge, you need the scientific knowledge, you need the technological knowledge, and only when these different perspectives are brought together in a coherent whole can you have traction, can you be effective. Otherwise, you're just climbing up yet another tree on your way to the moon. So we're just saying, okay, we reprogrammed an app for X, is essentially climbing up a tree to yet another moon. It's not enough. The technical challenges are really deep, and we have to attack these kinds of lifestyle medicine technological challenges from a very fundamental perspective, because we need scaling. As we all discussed, right? We have to reach out to the different communities that are at risk. We have to inform them. We have to support them. This is a massive scaling challenge. We talk about millions of people that we have to reach in an almost continuous 24/7 fashion. We must do this with technology. There's no other way. This is the only way to scale. But that means this is technology that must be clinically and scientifically informed. So what are the kinds of challenges that I think we should discuss now? Well, I'm sorry, we have to restart medicine. We have to reset the clock, and we should be theory-based. Let's first have a theory about the different pathologies that we want to treat, so we know in a more quantitative, objective, and controllable way what our interventions might or might not do. Let's give up on the clinical habits that rule clinical reality. They're not helping us. Correlations will not help us. We need theory, because the theory allows you to be wrong. And when you're wrong, you know where to look for improvement. Okay? And if you don't want to be wrong, then don't play the game of science. Because science, the game of science, is all about being wrong. Secondly, we should really warm up to this idea of networks of networks. Take our discussion here. It's not just a single organ system. It's not a single patient. It is also the patient embedded in a complex interactions with their environment, their social, cultural, political, economic environment. It's also the patient exposed to different, let's say, inflammatory factors, right? To different epigenetic factors. It's only when we find a quantitative way to capture this network of networks that we can have control over these complex, nonlinear, dynamical phenomena. This is the future. The other thing that you see, as opposed to just trying to look at the concepts of this and having a discussion on, let's say, the philosophy of science and what is truth in medicine, I think we should find that truth and having traction in the real world. Okay? Because we can understand the stuff we built, as Giambattista Vico told us in the 18th century. And I gave an example of this. I don't care about the whole technology stack that Google is presenting to us. That's their problem. We need to go across that whole stack and to find credibility for that whole approach. And that we only find by just identifying specific use cases and just give it the best you got. And show that you can solve that problem and have traction, as we now do. We're rolling this out in 3 different European countries for an acceptance test. So it's not about clinical or scientific validation. That's way behind us now. Now it's just to test this as a scalable product, because this is what we need also in the European health scene. Then in terms of data, more data is not better data. We should think carefully about the data we need. We need to think about curated data, because if you throw noise in, noise will come out, and there's no magic in any algorithm the Google engineers invent. Okay? If it's noise, it's noise. We should be much more careful in the kind of data that we're wishing for, because sometimes you get what you wish for. And it can get you in trouble. Then we should think about interventions as hypothesis testing. It's again bringing medicine back to science. It's not intuition, it's not the artist acting on the patient. No, every intervention is testing a hypothesis that is either confirmed or disproven. And if disproven, we must find a comprehensive and systematic way to make our next decision on the subsequent intervention. And then, of course, it automatically is linked to also medical intervention as being driven by theory. Because if I have a theory, I can have predictions. Then it's all about the patient, as far as I'm concerned. The middleman is an obstacle right now. It's an obstacle in financial terms. They take way too much of the budget we allocate to healthcare. But also it's an obstacle in terms of communication with that patient. There's a lot of medical knowledge we can really automate, okay? As the therapies we deliver. We don't need, as the diagnostics we deliver. The diagnostics we deliver to our patients using computers with a simple Kinect motion capture device on it is higher quality than any neurologist can do. Because I capture every movement of the patient at 80 Hertz. And I can exactly reconstruct the kinematics, and I know exactly how to correlate that with future outcomes. No human can do that. It's a level of precision you don't have, and it's also the time people don't have. So we should be much more critical. How can we shrink these medical industrial systems we have in between? How can we optimize our services to be closer to our patient? Because as we all agree, empowering the patient is what also lifestyle medicine is about. So then it's the team aspect, as I mentioned earlier. We have to approach this as teams. It's not only a medical challenge, it's a technological, psychological, neuroscientific challenge, and so on. Data management, last point. We need data. We need curated data to make progress. We need data of every potential patient. That's what I'm advocating, right? For every potential patient, we need a digital twin. So for all of you, we will have a digital twin, let's say on our phone, for in case something goes wrong. That we have a reference model that now can be used for testing interventions. But that, of course, means we have to rethink very much how we handle this kind of data. Right now, we left it in the hands of the big tech players. Well, if you're a believer in capitalism and optimality of the market, you might think that's a good idea. But I think we have no evidence that would support that belief. Right? So we have to think much more carefully about how we curate this kind of data. And I think we have to think about also protecting this data on the one hand from public bodies. Think about the way in which we protect the tax revenue information. Our governments, I think, should help us to build data banks and allow controlled access to this kind of data. But in addition to that, we should also think about, we all want sustainable healthcare, right? We know we cannot scale right now, but the sustainable healthcare needs your data. And maybe we should also have a discussion with our society about how contributing your data is almost like a civic duty to achieving sustainable lifestyle medicine. Thank you very much.
So the next person is someone who also has a tremendous amount of experience bringing computational modeling to the marketplace, and that's Steve Chang. So Steve, I'll give the podium to you.
Thank you, Jorn. This will be quick. I thought it would be useful, particularly from last night's discussion where there is talk about what's the right tool, what's the right setting to use that tool in, et cetera. To talk briefly about these two worlds that have been floating around. The one world, probably everyone has heard the word artificial intelligence or AI in one way, shape, or form almost every day. It's gotten to the point where it is probably an overused word, so much so that it has no meaning anymore. But to be more specific, machine learning, which is the kinds of things that the IBM Watsons, the Googles of the world, et cetera, are trying to do, is collect large aggregate forms of data, get all the little details of that data, and then run machine learning algorithms to try to discover patterns in that raw data. And you're doing that largely in absence of any real underlying theory. You want the data to describe to you what those theories or relationships are because you're seeing them in enough frequency, in enough circumstances to allow the machine learning to formulate these relationships. One of the challenges, of course, with this kind of an approach is that unless you have very large amounts of data, aka one clinical trial, even if it only had 10,000 patients, which is a really large clinical trial, would typically not really be enough data, depending on what kind of question you're trying to ask of that data, for a machine learning algorithm. However, when you're in an environment where solid theory doesn't exist, it's actually probably a very good way. Do we know a lot of ways of, for example, how the brain works, but can we really construct everything about the brain? Some people may say yes, other people may say no, but by the way, we have lots of data for it. Maybe try and see what theories the machine learning can create from that environment. Flipping over to the other side, you have what we call mechanistic or theory-driven models. What this is very formal causal structure. When I have a cell, I excite that cell with a particular cytokine, a particular reaction is going to happen. These are all observable phenomena that you can characterize, measure, and create specific theory about what's really going on. And the creation of what we call these mechanism-based models is exactly like that, right? You're creating science on the basis of what you know to be the theory of underlying behavior. Now, of course, those theories can evolve over time, right? Back in the day, there was only a single IL-17, and now we suddenly learn there's many more of them, and we're not sure how they work, et cetera. So theory can, of course, still evolve as well. One of the interesting aspects about theory, which was mentioned earlier today, is when you have theory, you can tell when you're wrong, because it broke your theory, or your theory isn't consistent with the observed data or information that you're seeing. The other area where these mechanism-based models are not useful is when you don't have enough theory or solid underlying knowledge about the problem space that you're trying to attack. So one of the interesting aspects that is, I believe, emerging, this is something that we do in-house as well, but there's not one versus the other. Certainly there's the application of where do theory-based models work best, another application where do the machine learning models work best, but there's also an environment where you can actually take the best of both worlds. You can build a theory-based model that has gaps, and then use machine learning along with as much data as you can muster to try to formulate ways to fill those gaps. And I think by hybridizing these two, what you can get is something that's much better than each individual one in what we call the complex settings or problems that we typically face today in these complex diseases. So I just wanted to give a little bit of almost a primer to try to give us some context, and then I'll let Yoram kick off the discussions. Thank you.
I mean, one of the things that we've done at UPMC is we've tried to address some of the issues that Paul was talking about, of how do we close that circle between the data that's being collected in the clinic and actually make it usable. And the only way to make it usable is to actually invest a lot of time doing the data curation that needs to be done, because there's a lot of institutions that have the ability to move data and deposit data in large databases or warehouses and whatnot. But we have found that while that's a necessary step, it is not sufficient in and of itself. And so we've spent a lot of time at UPMC doing the harmonization, the transformations, creating this groom layer of metadata tables that has allowed us to start actually in a more meaningful way, start consuming all the data that we're collecting in the real world as well as delivering care for our patients. And so sort of the mandate that we've been given is, how do we start to make those data that as we're delivering care we're generating, that real world data, more liquid, more meaningful, and the only way to get to that point is to spend the time to do the high levels of curation that Paul was talking about. And so we've built this infrastructure that several people in the audience have used to do retrospective analysis, to inform and generate hypotheses, We've applied machine learning techniques to come up with potentially new theories that can allow us to start asking questions. But at the same time, we have built the infrastructure so that we can utilize that same connectivity that we have within the system to actually start to implement pragmatic clinical trials using both the system, our IT infrastructure, and our patients, so that we can start to test those same hypotheses that we've generated through the process of retrospective learning, machine learning, and whatnot. And so at a very high level, that is the approach that we've taken to be able to make the data that gets collected as we deliver care more liquid and available.
So I thought I'd just pop up for a minute at this transition because as Oscar has talked about using our internal data, I'm looking at Gary right now, which largely is around the healthcare delivery system and how we're embedding things like social and demographic information that we have on the health plan side, sometimes from the public domain, not even healthcare, so we get the full picture of the patient and the family. The Adventist Health Study has been my true north for decades as I learn more about the populations. $25 million plus of NIH funding, the lessons learned about really real-world observational studies. So I'm going to tee up Dr. Fraser here to talk a little bit about the data journey, where you've been and where you'd like to go, and anything you've heard here, because you represent the gold standard in many ways, the living Framingham, over so many populations of Seventh-day, the Adventist population, which taught us so much. How does data view look for you going forward?
Well, thank you, Michael, for that. I think I'll forego my slide. I think it's become somewhat irrelevant. And some interesting stuff here, and I'll just kind of ad-lib a little bit. First of all, I mean, there's a huge data management problem that I won't go into, just of collecting nutritional data and making sense of it. But I think that's not where we want to go at the moment, even though that's a big deal. And we kind of know how to do that, even though it's hard. But going forward, you know, a number of you have said that correlations are not enough. Let me push back on that a little bit, because it seems to me that whatever we do, if we're going to use statistics in some way, and I haven't heard the word statistics very much around here, and I have some qualifications in statistics, that correlations, that's really our bread and butter. And it's not that correlations are bad, it's the interpretation of them, and more importantly, what we adjust for. And the beauty of a randomized controlled trial is not that it doesn't have a correlation. The end result is a correlation, but it's a very simple correlation, because all of the other correlates that might be important and confound are taken care of, but it's still a correlation. So the real question is, how do we do the right correlations? And really the book that some of us, was mentioned last night by Judea Pearl in causal analysis, is very much along those lines, because in observational work, which is really what we're stuck with here, like it or not, the goal is to emulate randomized controlled trials. And Pearl's analysis is, and his stipulation is that, yes, you can do that, and in fact you can, so long as you know all of the factors involved that might be confounding the exposure of real interest for you. And so it's a question of putting in the right covariates, being sure you've got the main ones, putting them in the model correctly, and he talks about collider variables and other things that you have to take care of on these models. So, you know, correlations are important, I think, but it's the right correlations. The other thing I would say is that as we have started to move on in our cohort to look at some of these big data types of things, and we've largely been working with DNA methylation and the methylome although in fact you can consider dietary data to be big data. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of foods and hundreds of nutrients, thousands of phytochemicals and things of that sort. But as we've got into this, I mean, how do you deal with, as we have at the moment, we have about 400 people, and each person has 400,000 data points, DNA methylation sites. Well, you see, if you just took a traditional type 1 error perspective, where 5% you're willing to accept as being erroneously positive, even if nothing was going on, they still were significant. You'd have 22,000, in our data, 22,500 significant results across those various DNA methylation sites when none of it meant a thing. So you've got to take a totally different perspective than traditional statistics that accounts for the false discovery rate. And there are ways of doing that I've had to become familiar with, so we can apply traditional statistics to these very high-dimensional things. If you don't, you very quickly run into the situation that you have a hypothesis that you found from somewhere, and you get a whole bunch of significant things. And these days with the literature, you know, you can go to the literature and find support for almost any hypothesis you want. So you can come up with a hypothesis that might be pretty crazy, but amongst 22,500 results that look like they're significant, if you don't know any better, you're going to find some support for that hypothesis. So, you know, that's craziness. We've got to do much better than that. And there are skills and techniques, but they're not being utilised in the way that they should be from what I can see in the literature. There's always an interpretive and a biological interpretive aspect to these things. You can't get away from that. But the more you can deal with a statistical probabilistic approach, to the extent that your data will allow it, you're going to be better off. We have some sad experience with kind of presenting candidate genes, for instance, for discovery and for a hypothesis based on good biology. But seeing that there are, you know, 22,000 genes, by and large, the candidates didn't work out. They might have been positive in one small study, but then nobody could duplicate it. So you're forced to take some other statistical methods in your discovery. And I think the machine learning is an interesting way to do it. That would be hypothesis generating, and I think that's what you meant, and then to be tested in some way by follow-up. Other things that we're starting to do, just very quickly, don't want to go on here too long. We're developing, as others have, or trying to develop a good electronic questionnaire for behaviours, particularly dietary behaviours, but also other behaviours. That's quite a challenge, but it's got some huge advantages cost-wise. And you know, one of the reasons that NCI and other institutes of NIH have become soft on cohorts is that they're very expensive. In Europe, of course, they've been using these electronic methods much more than we have, I think. But I think that's the way forward, because not only is it much less costly, it also, the computer allows you to do some checking in real time as people, if they skipped over a few questions, the computer won't let them go on, for instance. And so there are very useful aspects to that. I also think that biomarkers have got a big future that hasn't been fully explored as a means of giving us a better handle on the nutrients or the foods or even the dietary patterns that we're looking at. And they don't have to be only the biomarkers of intake, but these days one could, in theory at least, I think, create biomarkers from some of these high-dimensional things. I mean, why not a biomarker from some factor that's based on metabolomics, a bunch of metabolites that might be very different, say, between vegans and non-vegetarians, the kind of thing that we look at, or and you can use those in ways that I won't go into at the moment to enhance your analysis and to at least partially correct for measurement errors that you have in questionnaires. And perhaps the final point I would make is that we cannot give up on cohorts and think only about the mechanisms, because at the end of the day, you need both, and you need both equally. even if you've got fine studies and even randomized controlled trials that relate some of these biological mechanisms to disease outcomes, you've got to link the behavior to it in some way. And the only way you're going to get at the behavior on thousands of people probably is by questionnaire. So there's a great deal of value in continuing to improve our technology and techniques to establishing good questionnaire data, good cohort data. So.
Thank you very much. So maybe Dr. Silva, you could talk a little bit from your perspective, kind of maybe from the pediatric side and some of the work you're initiating and how that might relate to long-term lifestyle medicine considerations.
I think that's a fabulous transition with the mention of the cohorts. I was delighted to hear the Inhumans refrain yesterday, and I would absolutely underscore that, and I would immediately add, and humans only live in community, and communities only happen in neighborhoods. Because those things are true, we have to focus on the actual people. And that involves building relationships with them and having them, if we're going to do research, partnerships. Partnerships are based on trust. They're based on reciprocity. They're based on everybody expecting to sit down at the table, bring something to that table, and then leave with something more than what they sat down with. And that applies to researchers. I think that applies to funders. I think that applies to the folks who live in Wilkinsburg or Hazelwood or Arizona or wherever you like. In order for a robust cohort to be developed, I would suggest that the people involved in the research, all of the stakeholders, be at that table. Folks from the community, could be teachers, could be clergy members, could be parents. Think about parents because pediatrics has to be done that way. In addition to scientists and funders and the like. And it's the deliberate intention. You have something to offer. You the scientist, you the philanthropist, you the community member, you the stakeholder. You have something to offer. You should be paid for that. And maybe that's in terms of recognition, maybe that's in terms of grant dollars, maybe that's in terms of an incentive for a participant, maybe that's some sort of stipend for whatever expertise that is being brought to the table. But you have something to offer. Everybody sees that, everybody recognizes that, everybody's on the same team. If we're going to get the size of data sets that have been discussed here, those, I think, are the kinds of relationships that need to be fostered so that the apps can be built, so that the data can be mined, etc. And while we're on the topic of the data mining, if the people are at the table, the acceptability level is oh so much better. The participation rates are so much better. The retention rates are oh so much better. We're working on putting a model of this together with the Pittsburgh study out of the Department of Pediatrics. Happy to have more at the table.
Thank you so much. And so while we're kind of segueing, it was terrific, first of all, that you touched on some of the same points that Paul wrapped up, which is really the investment of the individuals and I guess the communities in providing the data that's necessary to be able to do any of this. So it's really a full circle. So we're on the theme of a full circle. I'd like to bring it now to Ron. So again, to emphasize how this meeting has been intertwined with the DoD-centered Human Performance Enhancement meeting that happened on Monday and Tuesday, with the bridge afternoon on Tuesday. And so, Ron, you've now had most of the meeting to kind of participate and think about. Some of the themes have been the same. Maybe you can give some of your perspectives, also from the point of view of perhaps applicability to DoD. And yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts.
No, I appreciate that. Just for the audience, I'm Ron Poropotich, retired Army physician, pulmonary critical care, 30 years of patient care at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. And I'm privileged to be at the University of Pittsburgh through the vision of Dr. Art Levine, who you'll be hearing from on the next session, where I direct the Center for Military Medicine Research. So what does that mean? How do we bring academia and DoD together with industry when possible to form the triple helix, industry, academia, government, to solve big societal problems. Military problems that we want to solve has direct translation to the civilian sector. Everything I'm going to talk about with any DoD relevance plays into the civilian sector. I wanted to focus on a couple main themes. We talked about underserved populations, addiction, social connectivity. I want to focus a little bit on how that plays into the military and civilian as it pertains to obesity, marijuana use, psychotropic meds, and the difficulties in weaning people off of psychotropic meds, and finally, sexual activity. It's my belief that social connectivity is important, but I would love to see the vision of this group to parse out sexual activity aside from social interaction. Now, I'm all for Blue Zone, you know, friends of five talking, and Japan and Greece, and having that social fabric. I think being part of a choir, book club, bridge club, that's critical, and I support that completely. But I think when we start looking at lifestyle medicine, we need to also talk about skin on skin, social intimacy. Not talking about penetration. The older you get, that's not going to be physically possible, but social intimacy can certainly still occur. And I would argue that that doesn't just fall under physical, you know, the ability to climb 2 flights of stairs to see if you can sustain a surgical procedure. I'm talking about how that plays into the same social fabric these other important venues take on. So I ask that you consider that identity, if you will, of social intimacy as its own separate biomarker. Now, in terms of the other key issues where it pertains to DoD, I mean, legalized marijuana is here and it's not going away, and I'm happy to see that. I went to University of Pittsburgh in the 70s, and you know, I smoked, but I did not inhale when I signed up for the Army. But 11 states have legalized it, 15 have decriminalized it, and 33 it's legalized for medical use. In Colorado, it's a $1.5 billion industry, as well as over $1 billion in Washington, Oregon, California. We know it has impacts on sleep, increases slow wave sleep, decreases sleep onset latency, decreases your REM. We also know that because of the cannabinoid type 1 receptor, it causes bronchodilation. So for some kids, it may help your asthma, right? The point is, we need to study it. And the pot smokers of the country and this world has doubled from 2001 to 2013. And to be honest with you, when I saw guys in the military on polypharmacy, as an internist, my job was to adjudicate your meds and give you the meds that you truly needed. I saw guys on 3 or 4 psychotropic drugs for PTSD, and I said, you know what? I'd stop all of that, taper it off slowly, talk to your doctor. But you can't, I would smoke some weed, you know, and just chill out a little bit and see if that helps you. And you'd be surprised how many guys already told me, Doc, my buddies are all telling me that. These military guys, it's a close community. When they start to see things that work, especially now with legalization so prevalent, they're moving away from psychotropics and more, where there's no clinical indication, by the way, for the FDA for some of these things, but we prescribe them anyhow. So I would offer up that young kids are smoking pot a lot, and I don't know how to dose it. I have family members that smoke it every day, and I'm like, gosh, you know, that's a lot of weed you're smoking. Did you ever give a drug holiday? Did you ever take like 2, 3, 4 days off? And we don't even know how to prescribe it. There's edibles, there's whole leaf product out there. We need to talk about that in lifestyle medicine. We're not putting that genie back in the bottle. And I can tell you, you smoke weed, you can't come on active duty, right? So what does that mean? Right now, obesity is a major problem. 30% of 17 to 24-year-olds are unfit to serve in the military because of obesity, or as they say, too fat to fight. So we have a major problem of not only kids. We heard this. Mike gave the story of a 10-year-old child who's, you know, BMI of 35, and that's just ridiculous to see young children. So we need to start looking at how is marijuana going to affect not just the recruitment for the military, which, by the way, obesity is threatening national security. We have right now, in order to get in the military, you have to have a high school diploma, no criminal record, no chronic medical condition, and you have to pass an entry exam. Well, guess what? That's 29%. Less than 1/3 of American kids, 17 to 24, can pass all of that. When you add obesity to the picture, now you're down to 5 to 15% of kids in this country that can even serve in the military. So I would argue that, forget it, you don't want to serve, only 2% of kids want to serve in the military, by the way. I don't care if you want to serve or not. As a physician who's taking care of a lot of family members in the DoD and civilian sector, I think we need to get our arms around obesity, as we've been talking about, marijuana, which we need to talk about more because that's going to become a bigger issue. And then the last point, psychotropic meds. I can't tell you how many folks I see chronically on Xanax, Zoloft, Celexa, Prozac, Ativan, Lexapro, Adderall. These special ops guys, and you're going to hear from Colonel Juncker in a few minutes on the next session. These guys, they take Adderall when they were kids, right? They go on a night mission. They work all day. Guess what? We're going on the chopper. We're going to a landing zone. We're going to kill some bad guys, take a hard drive computer, and bring back some DNA. And guess what? That starts at 11 p.m. So these guys are popping Adderall, downrange, caffeine, whatever they can get their hands on. But I argue that if you got kids in college, I guarantee you they can find someone on campus that'll give them Adderall. They'll either give it to them or you can buy it for $1 or $5 a pill. We need to talk about that social issue just like we need to talk about marijuana. Because guess what? You're on Adderall, you can't come on active duty. Again, Civ. Everything I talk about with the civilian sector impacts the military. So we want, because we're all, patriotic Americans, a strong military to defend us against bad guys. And believe me, there are plenty of bad guys out there. But if we don't have a population fit to serve because of marijuana, obesity, psychotropic meds, we need to address that. There are many people in programs that have providers that are constantly being pinged about, hey, does this guy still need to be on this antidepressant, right? There was a situational depression, someone died in the family, et cetera. Well, 6 months later, are you over the depression? Can we at least consider taking you and weaning you off? There's a wonderful article in the New Yorker dated 8 April 2019. It's a wonderful issue on the withdrawal project, how hard it is to withdraw people off of psychotropics. So in addition to obesity, marijuana that we need to get our hands on, we also need to at least, I think, address as a lifestyle medicine community the rational use of psychotropic meds and how to withdraw them and when to withdraw them, and to educate people about that. And then to have some trend analysis of sexual intimacy. Are we less intimate now as a society? I'm a Croatian kid. I have a European kind of upbringing. Sexual intimacy was very different for me growing up with my parents than what I see in other families. So, what's it like in America today? How does that compare to Latin America or other cultures? So these are some of my thoughts. I can get into big DoD data, but I think we heard enough about data. I would rather be provocative and throw out these hand grenades and see what you all think about that. So I'll start.
Right, I'd like to applaud Ron for usually when sex comes into it, it's like time for a coffee break or a reception, and yet unfortunately we're not quite there. But we can take a couple extra minutes because, Ron, I do want to ask you though about, so you brought up all these things. You said all this stuff is massive confounders. What are the actual are there any attempts within the DoD to create the data sets that have this data and to study them, and perhaps those attempts can dovetail with attempts in the civilian sector, perhaps at UPMC or other places that somehow can be joined maybe through computational approaches, et cetera.
Absolutely, and the reason we stood up this 2-day DoD meeting, we overlapped the last session with lifestyle medicine with Mike, Yoram, Tim Billier, and Paul Verschure speaking, is because the DoD is all in on AI big data. Just like UPMC, they're sitting on millions and millions of people's data, and they need to get their arms around it. But they also know that the bad guys, our near-peer nations that we're going to go up against, have put a lot of money into AI. And we know that we need to get ahead of that. We're starting a little bit behind. So what's being done? Colonel Caesar Juncker, he's part of the Joint AI Center. Major lift. Billions and billions of dollars going into the Joint AI Center. How does Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine look at big data across many different domains? Not just preventive maintenance of aircraft, long-range precision fires, but health. In addition, in Pittsburgh, we have the Army Futures Command AI Task Force. We have 7 military officers assigned here in Pittsburgh looking at the Army's perspective on big data. And they've asked me to convene a meeting in April with the Army Futures Command focused on the intersect of medical and AI. Big Army's asking that. Not Army Medical Department, big Army, because now the warfighter and medical is coming together. Medical is no longer separated from the warfighter community. It's a part of cognitive resilience and all these other things. So it is my hope that the lifestyle medicine community here, with the Pitt community, with all the established military presence in the city and elsewhere, will be embracing this AI and putting a bigger push into the medical space, which will again benefit not just the military but the civilian sectors as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would like to respond to Ron's challenge on the cannabis epidemic, if you want. So it might not come as a surprise that in Europe we have similar problems. And one problem that you have with these chronic cannabis users is that they don't seek treatment, even though they really have problems. But since they just exist in the now, they don't experience that tomorrow there's a problem. And so we talked with the clinic, the addiction clinic in Barcelona on that. And now for the last 15 years, we've done a lot of work on motor learning. And from these models we've built, we had learned a few things, which is that the cognitive control of the frontal cortex is densely interfaced to the motor control, the procedural control of your cerebellum. And we also know that there's a strong presence of CB1 receptors in the cerebellum. And we also know that in the cerebellum you have morphological changes in chronic cannabis users. So what we now did, putting that all together, the prediction was, well, if I give a cannabis user a task where you have to combine executive control, frontal cortex, with motor adaptation, cerebellum, you should start to see differences relative to control population. And this turns out to be true. So for instance, they have great difficulties to adjust their responses if there are rule changes in a simple task. So now we've built a simple app for a tablet that can go to all the addiction clinics now in Catalonia, I live in Barcelona, where the cannabis users can do a very simple motor task, where there's a simple rule they have to follow, and there's a little cursor that they move about. But this task is put together in such a way that it helps them to understand they have a problem. So now it becomes part of a treatment or an intervention planning to build metacognition in these users, say, look, there's something you should work on. And the hope now is, this is what is being tested right now, that in that sense we can improve people's adherence to treatment approaches, because at least they have a metacognitive understanding, or some people might want to call it mindfulness, they have an understanding that there's a problem to be solved. This is what's being rolled out, but it came straight again from a pure theoretical set of considerations, like, well, if all these things are true given our theories, then this task should work, and it did. Okay, so I think there's a lot of mileage here in sort of model-based, AI-heavy approaches. You know?
That's really, really terrific. Are there any other questions? Or if not, we will thank the panel and move on to our next panel. Thank you very much.